The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in an unmarked manila envelope with no return address and no explanation whatsoever. Inside was a single image of a 7-year-old boy with striking almond-shaped eyes, dark hair, and a smile that could stop your heart if you knew where to look. Park Jin-woo held that photograph in his hands for exactly 11 minutes, without moving, without breathing, without blinking, because those eyes staring back at him from that glossy print were his own eyes, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes his father had, the same eyes that had been passed down through 3 generations of the Park family in Seoul, South Korea. But this boy, this child whose face he was seeing for the very first time, wasn't in Seoul, and he wasn't part of any family registry or any official record that Jin-woo had ever kept. This boy was in Atlanta, Georgia, living with a woman Jin-woo had walked away from 8 years earlier, a woman he had loved more than anything in this world, and then abandoned without explanation, without goodbye, without ever looking back. The photograph had no note, no demand, no threat written on the back, just 3 words scrawled in Korean characters that translated simply to "He has your eyes." And in that moment, Park Jin-woo, one of the most powerful and feared organized crime figures in all of South Korea, realized that the past he thought he had buried forever had just knocked on his door, and it wanted answers. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a high-ranking member of one of Korea's most dangerous criminal organizations could fall in love with an American woman, keep that relationship secret for nearly 2 years, and then vanish without a trace, you need to understand 3 fundamental truths about the world Park Jin-woo inhabited. First, the Korean organized crime syndicates known as Kangpai operate on principles of absolute loyalty, bloodline heritage, and the preservation of Korean identity above all else. And any deviation from these principles, any hint of weakness or divided loyalty, is met with swift and often brutal consequences. Second, in the criminal underworld of 1990s, Seoul reputation meant everything, and Jin-woo's reputation was that of a man who never let emotions cloud his judgment, never made decisions based on anything other than cold, calculated strategy, and never ever put personal desires above the needs of the organization that his grandfather had helped build from nothing. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the woman he fell in love with in Atlanta, Tanya Morrison, was everything his world told him she couldn't be. She was American, she was black, she was independent, educated, strong-willed, and completely unimpressed by the carefully constructed persona he had spent his entire life building. So how does a man like Jin-woo end up in a situation where he's receiving photographs of a child he never knew existed 8 years after walking away from the only woman he ever truly loved? How does someone who built their entire life on secrets and shadows suddenly find themselves exposed, vulnerable, and facing a choice between the empire they've built and the family they abandoned? And most importantly, who sent that photograph? What did they want, and what were they willing to do to get it? These are the questions that would ultimately force Park Jin-woo to confront not just his past, but the very foundation of everything he believed about loyalty, honor, and what it truly means to be a man. Because by the time this story reaches its conclusion, you'll understand that some secrets refuse to stay buried, some choices can never be undone, and some children grow up asking questions that their mothers simply cannot answer. Seoul, South Korea in 1995 was a city of contradictions, a place where ancient traditions collided with rapid modernization, where centuries-old Confucian values existed alongside Western capitalism, and where beneath the surface of legitimate business dealings there thrived an intricate network of organized crime that had roots stretching back generations. Park Jin-woo was born into this world in 1967, the 3rd generation of a family that had built its fortune and its reputation through what outsiders might call criminal enterprise, but what those within the organization simply called business. His grandfather, Park Dae-young, had been one of the original Kangpai bosses in the aftermath of the Korean War, a time when the entire peninsula was in chaos and men, with vision and ruthlessness, could carve out empires from the rubble and desperation that surrounded them. By the time Jin-woo was old enough to understand what his family actually did, his grandfather was already a legend in Seoul's underworld, a man who controlled the port district and everything that moved through it, both legal and otherwise. Jin-woo's father Park Sung-ho had inherited that empire and expanded it, bringing sophistication and modern business practices to operations that had previously relied solely on intimidation and violence. Sung-ho understood that the future belonged to those who could navigate both worlds, the legitimate and the criminal, with equal skill, and he raised his son accordingly. Jin-woo attended the best schools in Seoul, learned to speak English fluently, studied international business and economics, and was groomed from childhood to be the kind of leader who could take the Park family organization into the 21st century. But here's what made Jin-woo different from the typical third-generation gangster. He was genuinely intelligent, genuinely curious about the world beyond Seoul's neon-lit streets, and genuinely conflicted about the path that had been laid out for him before he was even old enough to choose it for himself. He excelled at everything his father asked of him, demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and ruthless decision-making that the old guard respected, and by his mid-20s had already earned a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the organization's most sensitive operations. Yet those who knew him well, and there were very few who could claim that privilege, sometimes caught glimpses of something else beneath the carefully maintained exterior, a restlessness, a hunger for something more than what his predetermined future offered. In 1996, when Jin-woo was 28 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. The Park organization had been expanding its operations beyond South Korea, establishing connections with criminal networks in Japan, China, and increasingly in the United States, and they needed someone who could move between these worlds, someone who spoke the language, understood Western business culture, and could be trusted to represent the family's interests abroad. Jin-woo was the obvious choice, and so in the spring of that year, he found himself on a plane to Atlanta, Georgia, ostensibly to attend an international business conference, but really to begin establishing relationships and exploring opportunities for the organization in the American Southeast. Atlanta in the mid-90s was a city experiencing its own transformation, a place that had shed much of its past and was positioning itself as a major international business hub, especially with the 1996 Olympic Games bringing unprecedented attention and investment to the region. For Jin-woo, it represented something he had never really experienced before: freedom. In Seoul, he was always Park Jin-woo, grandson of Dae-young, son of Sung-ho, heir to an empire that came with expectations and obligations and eyes watching his every move. But in Atlanta, he was just another Korean businessman in an expensive suit, one face among thousands in a city too busy growing and changing to pay much attention to the private affairs of visiting foreigners. The conference itself was unremarkable, the kind of event where business cards were exchanged, contacts were made, and very little of actual substance was discussed in the official sessions. Jin-woo played his part perfectly, made the right introductions, smiled at the right times, and gave every appearance of being exactly what he claimed to be: a representative of a Seoul-based import-export firm looking to expand operations in North America. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't have possibly prepared for, was meeting someone who would see right through that carefully constructed facade and force him to confront aspects of himself he had spent his entire life trying to ignore. Tanya Morrison was 26 years old in the spring of 1996, and she was exhausted in the way that only someone working 2 jobs while pursuing a graduate degree can truly understand. By day, she worked as a pediatric nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital in downtown Atlanta, dealing with the kind of cases that would break most people's hearts: sick children from families who couldn't afford proper health care, kids who came in with preventable illnesses because their parents didn't have insurance or couldn't take time off work to bring them to a doctor. By night and on weekends, she was a graduate student at Georgia State University, working toward a master's degree in public health with a focus on pediatric care in underserved communities. And in whatever spare moments she could find, she picked up translation work at international conferences because she happened to be fluent in Korean, a skill she had acquired almost by accident. Tanya's grandmother had worked for a Korean family in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta back in the 1960s and 70s, and that family had treated her grandmother with a kindness and respect that was unfortunately rare for Black domestic workers in that era. When Tanya was growing up, her grandmother would tell stories about the Kim family, about their traditions, their food, their language, and young Tanya had been fascinated. She taught herself basic Korean from library books and tapes, and later in college had taken formal language courses, partly because she was genuinely interested and partly because she knew it would be a practical skill in an increasingly globalized world. By the time she was translating at that business conference in 1996, she was fluent enough to handle complex technical discussions, though she would be the first to admit that some of the more nuanced cultural aspects of the language still escaped her. She noticed Jin-woo immediately on the second day of the conference, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was, or because he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that made people pay attention, though he did, but because of something she saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Tanya had spent years working with children and pained children who were trying to be brave, trying to smile through suffering, and she had learned to recognize that particular expression, the one that said, "I'm holding something heavy inside, and I don't know how much longer I can carry it." She saw that same expression flash across Jin-woo's face during a break between sessions when he was standing alone near the windows looking out at the Atlanta skyline with an expression that could only be described as longing. Their first actual conversation was brief and entirely professional. Jin-woo approached her to ask about some of the technical terminology that had been used in a presentation about medical equipment manufacturing, and Tanya provided a clear explanation in Korean, then switched to English to offer additional context. What struck her was how carefully he listened, not just to the words, but to the way she spoke, looking for meaning beneath the surface, the same way she had learned to do with patients who couldn't or wouldn't tell her what was really wrong. Before he walked away, he thanked her in Korean, then added in English with just the slightest trace of an accent, "I appreciate your precision," and Tanya found herself smiling at the formality of it, the way he chose his words so carefully, as if each one mattered. They ran into each other again that evening at the hotel bar, both claiming they were there to unwind after a long day, but really, if either of them had been honest, they would have admitted they were hoping to see each other again. Jin-woo bought her a drink. They talked about Atlanta, about Seoul, about the ways cities change and grow, and sometimes lose pieces of themselves in the process. Tanya told him about her work at the hospital, about the children she saw every day, about her dreams of creating better healthcare systems for communities that had been overlooked and underserved for generations. Jin-woo talked about Seoul, about the tension between tradition and modernity, about growing up with certain expectations and trying to figure out how to honor your family while also being true to yourself. What he didn't tell her, at least not that first night, was what his family actually did, what those expectations really meant, or why a man his age, who clearly came from money and influence, seemed to carry himself like someone living in exile from his own life. And Tanya, being observant and intuitive as she was, recognized that there were things he wasn't saying, recognized the careful way he edited himself in real time, choosing what to reveal and what to keep hidden. But instead of pushing, instead of demanding answers, she simply listened and asked questions and created the kind of space where someone might eventually feel safe enough to tell the truth. They saw each other every day for the remaining 3 days of the conference, always in public, always maintaining the appearance of professional acquaintances who happened to enjoy each other's company. On the last day, Jin-woo asked if she would have dinner with him somewhere away from the conference hotel, somewhere quieter, and Tanya said yes, even though something in the back of her mind was already warning her that this man, whoever he really was, carried the kind of complications that could upend her carefully planned life. She ignored that warning because Jin-woo looked at her the way no one had looked at her before, not with the usual interest or attraction, but with something deeper, something that suggested he saw her, really saw her, in a way that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and valued. That dinner lasted 4 hours. They talked about everything and nothing, about childhood and dreams and disappointments and hopes. Jin-woo told her carefully edited versions of his life in Seoul, his work, his family's business, never quite lying, but never quite revealing the whole truth either. Tanya told him about growing up in Atlanta, about being raised by her grandmother after her mother died when she was 12, about working her way through school and building a life that was entirely her own creation, not inherited, not given, but earned through sheer determination and sacrifice. And somewhere during that dinner, between the main course and dessert, something shifted between them. Some invisible line was crossed, and they both knew, without saying it out loud, that this wasn't just a pleasant evening between two people who would never see each other again after tomorrow. When Jin-woo walked Tanya back to her car that night, he told her he had to return to Seoul in 2 days, but that he would be back in Atlanta in 3 weeks for business. He asked if he could see her again when he returned, and Tanya surprised herself by saying yes, without hesitation, without the usual caution she applied to everything else in her life. She gave him her phone number, watched him write it down in a small leather notebook that he kept in his jacket pocket, And then before she could second-guess herself, she stood on her toes and kissed him on the cheek, a brief touch that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but somehow managed to communicate everything that neither of them quite knew how to say with words. Park Jin-woo kept his promise. He returned to Atlanta 3 weeks later, and then again 3 weeks after that, and then again, establishing a pattern that would define the next 18 months of his life. 3 weeks in Seoul, managing territory disputes, mediating conflicts between different factions of the organization, collecting tributes from businesses under Park family protection, attending the endless meetings and dinners and ceremonies that were required of someone in his position. 10 days in Atlanta with Tanya, living a completely different life, a completely different version of himself. He told her he worked in international shipping for his family's company, which was technically true if you considered that the Park organization did indeed move goods across international borders, though the nature of those goods and the methods used to move them weren't exactly what Tanya imagined when he described his work. He told his father and the other senior members of the organization that he was developing American operations, establishing relationships with potential partners, exploring opportunities for expansion in the southeastern United States. This was also technically true. Jin-woo did make legitimate business contacts in Atlanta, did identify potential investments and partnerships that could benefit the organization. But the real reason he kept returning, the reason he scheduled his trips with such careful regularity, had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that being with Tanya Morrison made him feel like a person rather than a position, like Jin-woo rather than Park Jin-woo, heir to an empire built on violence and fear and generations of carefully maintained reputation. Tanya introduced him to her world, and it was so different from everything he had known that at first he barely knew how to navigate it. She took him to Sunday service at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. had once preached, and Jin-woo, who had never been particularly religious, found himself moved by the music, the passion, the sense of community and shared history that filled that space. She took him to Pascal's Restaurant, a legendary soul food establishment that had been a gathering place for civil rights leaders in the 1960s, and she explained the significance of the food they were eating, how recipes and cooking traditions had been passed down through generations, how food was about more than sustenance, it was about culture and memory and survival. She took him to the King Center and walked him through the exhibition, explaining the history of the American civil rights movement, the struggles and sacrifices that had been made, the ongoing work that still needed to be done. Jin-woo listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and found himself drawing unexpected parallels between the Korean concept of Han, that deeply rooted sense of historical suffering and injustice that defines so much of Korean cultural identity, and the African-American experience of oppression and resistance and resilience that Tanya described. They had long conversations about identity, about what it means to carry your history with you, about the weight of being part of a community that has survived through collective strength rather than individual achievement. In return, Jin-woo introduced Tanya to aspects of Korean culture that she hadn't encountered in her academic study of the language. He cooked for her in her tiny apartment kitchen, preparing dishes his mother had taught him when he was young, carefully explaining the significance of certain ingredients, the proper way to make kimchi, the importance of sharing food as an expression of care and connection. He taught her about Confucian concepts of loyalty and filial piety, explaining in careful terms how Korean society was structured around these principles, how obligations to family and hierarchy shaped everything from business relationships to personal decisions. What he didn't tell her was how those same principles were used in his world to justify violence, to enforce loyalty, to maintain control over people who had very little choice in the matter. Tanya's grandmother met Jin-woo exactly once, about 8 months into their relationship. Tanya had been avoiding it, partly because she wasn't sure how to explain this relationship to her grandmother, partly because she knew her grandmother would have questions she couldn't or wouldn't answer. But eventually the old woman simply showed up at Tanya's apartment one Sunday afternoon when Jin-woo happened to be there, and Tanya had no choice but to introduce them. Jin-woo was respectful, bowed slightly when they were introduced, spoke to her with the kind of formal courtesy that would have been appropriate when addressing an elder in Korean culture, and the grandmother studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. After Jin-woo excused himself to take a phone call, the grandmother turned to Tanya and said in a voice that carried both concern and hard-earned wisdom, "Baby, that man is running from something or running towards something. I can't tell which, but either way you're going to get hurt." Tanya wanted to argue, wanted to defend Jin-woo, wanted to insist that her grandmother was wrong, but she couldn't because somewhere deep down she knew it was true. She had known from the beginning that Jin-woo was hiding something, had seen the way he carefully edited his stories, the way certain phone calls made him tense, the way he sometimes woke in the middle of the night with an expression that suggested he was carrying weights she couldn't see. But she had chosen to ignore those signs, had chosen to believe that whatever he was hiding couldn't be as serious as her instincts suggested, had chosen love over caution, because being with Jin-woo made her happy in a way she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. The relationship settled into a rhythm that worked for both of them, even if it wasn't quite what either of them would have chosen under different circumstances. Jin-woo would arrive in Atlanta, call Tanya from the airport, and they would spend the next 10 days building a life that existed in a carefully maintained bubble separate from the reality, waiting for both of them outside. They went to movies, tried new restaurants, took weekend trips to the mountains or the coast, spent long evenings talking about everything except the future, because the future was the one topic they both knew they couldn't address without breaking whatever fragile thing they had built together. Tanya's friends met Jin-woo and liked him, thought he was a little formal, a little reserved, but clearly devoted to Tanya, clearly someone who treated her with respect and genuine affection. They asked the usual questions: how they met, what he did for work, when he was going to move to Atlanta permanently, and Tanya gave vague answers that satisfied most people most of the time. Only her closest friend Monica, a nurse she had worked with for years who had known Tanya long enough to read her better than most, ever pushed back, asking directly, "Girl, what exactly does this man do that has him flying back and forth to Korea every month? And why won't you give me a straight answer about it?" Tanya had laughed it off, changed the subject, but Monica's question echoed in her mind during the long weeks when Jin-woo was back in Seoul, and she was left alone with her thoughts and her growing awareness that she had fallen in love with a man whose real life remained fundamentally mysterious to her. March 1998, Tanya missed her period, and at first she told herself it was stress. She had been working extra shifts at the hospital, her graduate school finals were coming up, she hadn't been sleeping well, it was probably nothing. But when 2 weeks became 3 and certain other signs became impossible to ignore, she bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy across town where no one would recognize her, and took it in the bathroom of her apartment at 6 in the morning before heading to work. The result was positive, immediately, unmistakably positive, and Tanya sat on the edge of her bathtub staring at that little plastic stick, feeling like the entire carefully constructed structure of her life had just shifted beneath her feet. She was 28 years old, unmarried, involved with a man who lived on the other side of the world and maintained significant aspects of his life as mysteries she had chosen not to investigate too closely. She was in the middle of graduate school, working 2 jobs, trying to build a career in public health, trying to create the kind of life that would make her grandmother proud, that would justify all the sacrifices that had been made to get her this far. A baby wasn't part of the plan, not now, not like this, not with a man she loved, but didn't entirely understand, and certainly didn't have any promises from about what their future might look like. For 2 weeks, she didn't tell anyone, didn't tell her friends, didn't tell her grandmother, certainly didn't tell Jin-woo, who was in Seoul, dealing with what he had described in their brief phone conversations as some complicated family business that required his full attention. She went to work, smiled at patients, answered questions about their children's health, while her own situation remained unaddressed. She went to class, took notes on maternal and child health policy, while privately wondering how she was going to manage being a mother herself. And late at night, she lay awake thinking about all the possible ways this could unfold, trying to prepare herself for conversations she didn't want to have, trying to imagine Jin-woo's reaction, and realizing she genuinely didn't know how he would respond. Jin-woo was scheduled to return to Atlanta in late March, and Tanya decided she would tell him then in person, because this wasn't the kind of news you delivered over a crackling international phone connection. She practiced different approaches, tried to find words that would communicate both the reality of the situation and her own complicated feelings about it, tried to anticipate his questions and prepare answers that were honest without being accusatory. She didn't want him to think she had planned this, didn't want him to feel trapped, but she also needed him to understand that this was happening whether either of them had planned for it or not, and that she needed to know where he stood, what role, if any, he wanted to play in whatever came next. When Jin-woo arrived at her apartment that March evening, he looked different, more tense than usual, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He embraced her, held her perhaps a moment longer than usual, and Tanya felt her carefully prepared speech evaporate as she simply held him and wondered how she was going to change everything between them with the words she needed to say. They ordered takeout, sat on her couch, making small talk about his flight, about her work, about nothing of real importance, and Tanya kept thinking, now tell him now, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, after dinner, after they had moved to her small balcony and were sitting in the warm spring evening watching the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, Tanya took a deep breath and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished, okay? Jin-woo turned to look at her, and something in his expression suggested he knew whatever came next was going to be significant. She told him about the pregnancy, told him she was about 8 weeks along, told him she had already seen a doctor, and everything appeared to be progressing normally, told him she hadn't made any decisions yet about what she was going to do, but that she needed him to be honest with her, really honest in a way he hadn't always been, about what this meant and what he wanted. Jin-woo's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, surprise certainly, but also something else, something Tanya couldn't quite read at first. It wasn't anger, wasn't fear, it was calculation, the same expression she imagined he wore in business meetings when presented with new information that required him to reassess his strategies and adjust his plans accordingly. And in that moment, Tanya Morrison realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that she might not actually know the man she loved as well as she had convinced herself she did. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Jin-woo asked questions about timing, about her health, about what she needed both practically and emotionally. He held her hand, told her he cared about her, told her they would figure this out together. But there was something in his voice, something in the way he chose his words so carefully that made Tanya feel like she was negotiating with him rather than talking with him, like this was a problem to be managed rather than a life they had created together. She asked him directly, do you want this baby? Do you want to be a father? And Jin-woo was silent for a long moment before saying, I want whatever you want, I'll support whatever decision you make, which was the kind of answer that sounded supportive, but was really just a way of avoiding giving an actual answer. That night, after Jin-woo had left telling her he needed to make some phone calls, needed to check in with his office in Seoul, needed to think about logistics, Tanya lay in bed, knowing with absolute certainty that something had shifted between them. The man who had held her that evening had been present physically, but emotionally, he had already started to pull away, had already started calculating how to manage this situation in a way that would minimize disruption to whatever his real life in Seoul entailed. And Tanya, who had built her entire adult life on being strong and independent and not needing anyone, suddenly felt more alone than she had since her mother died 16 years earlier. What Tanya didn't know, because Jin-woo had never told her, was that 3,000 miles away in Seoul, his father Park Sung-ho had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis had come 2 months earlier, and the prognosis was grim, maybe 6 months, maybe less, depending on how aggressively the disease progressed. Sung-ho had kept the news quiet at first, telling only his most trusted advisors, while he made arrangements to ensure a smooth transition of power within the organization. But word had eventually leaked, as these things always do, and now various factions within the Park organization and allied groups were positioning themselves, trying to figure out what Sung-ho's death would mean for the intricate web of alliances and obligations that held the Korean underworld together. Jin-woo had been recalled to Seoul multiple times over the past 2 months for meetings that ostensibly were about routine business matters, but were really about the senior leadership evaluating him, assessing whether he was ready to step into his father's role, whether he had the strength and the judgment and the ruthlessness necessary to maintain the Park family's position. These evaluations had gone well. Jin-woo had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the old guard wanted to see, had made difficult decisions without hesitation, had shown that he understood the principles of loyalty and hierarchy that governed their world. But there were whispers, concerns that Jin-woo spent too much time in America, that his extended absences suggested divided loyalties, that he might not be fully committed to the organization and its traditions. The phone call came 2 days after Tanya told Jin-woo about the pregnancy. He was alone in his hotel room at 2 in the morning Atlanta time when his phone rang, and his father's most senior advisor, a man named Kim, who had served the Park family for 40 years, spoke in formal Korean and delivered a message that was simultaneously an invitation and a command. The Council of Senior Bosses wanted to meet with Jin-woo immediately to discuss the transition of leadership and his father's succession. Jin-woo needed to return to Seoul within 48 hours, no exceptions, no delays. This was not negotiable. Jin-woo understood immediately what this meant. The timeline had accelerated, his father's condition must have worsened, and the organization was moving quickly to establish clear lines of authority before rival groups could exploit any perceived weakness. This was the moment he had been prepared for his entire life, the moment when he would step into the role that 3 generations of Park men had held before him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had been trained to do was now within reach, and all he had to do was get on a plane and return to Seoul and accept the responsibilities that came with his birthright. But now there was Tanya, and there was a child, his child growing inside her, a child who would carry his blood, his DNA, his eyes. In Korean culture, in the world Jin-woo came from, bloodline was everything. Children were the continuation of family legacy, the living link between past and future, the reason men built empires in the first place. The idea of having a child and simply walking away from that child was fundamentally at odds with everything Jin-woo had been taught about duty and responsibility and honor. But equally, the idea of acknowledging that child, of openly claiming a relationship with an American woman, a Black American woman, and asking his organization to accept that relationship was simply impossible. The senior leadership of the Park organization were traditionalists, men in their 60s and 70s who had built their power in a Korea that was far more insular, far more ethnically homogenous than the modern Seoul they now operated in. To them, Korean identity was sacred, bloodline purity was essential, and any suggestion that Jin-woo had created a mixed-race child with a foreign woman would be seen as betrayal, contamination, weakness. It wouldn't matter that Tanya was educated, accomplished, respected in her field. It wouldn't matter that Jin-woo loved her. These were not considerations that held any weight in a world where tradition and ethnic identity and maintaining face were the foundations of power. Jin-woo spent the next 24 hours in a kind of paralysis, unable to make a decision, unable to move forward in any direction. He thought about taking Tanya with him to Seoul, thought about introducing her to his father, thought about trying to make the organization accept reality. But he knew his father would never agree, knew that showing up with Tanya, especially now, especially pregnant, would be seen as provocative, disrespectful, an indication that Jin-woo was not ready to lead. He thought about refusing the summons, about telling his father and the council that he was staying in America, that he was choosing a different path. But he knew that refusal would mean the end of everything, exile from his family, disgrace for his father, potential danger for everyone involved, because in his world, you didn't just walk away from obligations that had been 3 generations in the making. He thought about asking Tanya to wait, asking her to keep the pregnancy quiet, to give him time to establish himself in Seoul, and then maybe later find a way to bring her and the child into his life in some capacity that the organization might accept. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was cowardice, knew it was asking her to build her life around his convenience, asking her to hide their child, asking her to accept a role as a secret, as something shameful, when she deserved to be honored and celebrated. And Jin-woo, who had been trained from childhood to make difficult decisions without emotion, without hesitation, suddenly found himself unable to think clearly, unable to see a path forward that didn't require him to betray either his family or the woman he loved. The decision was ultimately made for him by his father's advisor Kim, who called again 36 hours after the first call and spoke in a tone that conveyed both urgency and finality. Sung-ho's condition had worsened significantly. He might not have more than a few weeks left, and Jin-woo needed to return immediately if he wanted to see his father alive again, if he wanted to receive his father's blessing for the transition of power, if he wanted to claim his birthright. There was no more time for deliberation, no more time for trying to figure out how to reconcile 2 incompatible worlds. Jin-woo had to choose, and he had to choose now. April 17, 1998, Jin-woo told Tanya he had to fly to Los Angeles for an emergency business meeting, something about a shipment that had been delayed and customs issues that required his immediate attention. He would be back in 5 days, maybe a week at most, and then they would sit down and really talk about the future, make real plans, figure out how to make this work. He said all of this while packing his suitcase, while carefully not meeting Tanya's eyes, while maintaining the kind of calm, reasonable tone that people use when they're saying things they know aren't entirely true. Tanya wanted to believe him, wanted to accept this explanation at face value, because the alternative, that Jin-woo might be lying to her, that he might be pulling away, that the pregnancy had fundamentally changed something between them, was too painful to fully acknowledge. So she helped him pack, asked if he had everything he needed, told him to call her when he landed. At the airport, Jin-woo held her for a long moment, his hand resting on her stomach, where their child was growing, cells dividing, becoming a person, becoming someone who would have his eyes and his blood and no idea who their father really was. He kissed her forehead, said something in Korean that Tanya didn't understand, and then he walked through security and disappeared into the terminal. The first day, Tanya wasn't worried. Jin-woo often had long flights with connections, and by the time he dealt with time zone changes and got to his hotel, it was usually several hours before he called. The second day, she started to feel uneasy. She called his cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail, left messages that weren't returned. The third day, she called the hotel he had mentioned in Los Angeles and was told they had no reservation under that name, no record of him checking in. The fourth day, she went to the apartment Jin-woo kept in Atlanta for his visits and found it empty, completely empty, as if no one had ever lived there at all. The fifth day, she called the import-export company he claimed to work for and was told by a confused receptionist that no one by that name had ever been employed there, that she must have the wrong company. By the end of the first week, Tanya had to accept the reality she had been trying to avoid. Jin-woo was gone. Not delayed, not dealing with a business emergency, but actually gone, vanished, disappeared, as if the entire relationship had been something she imagined. His phone was disconnected, his apartment was empty, his company didn't exist, and Tanya was left alone, pregnant, and facing the realization that she had fallen in love with a man who had lied to her about fundamental aspects of his identity and his life. She cried for 2 days, called in sick to work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function under the weight of betrayal and confusion and the terrifying knowledge that she was going to have to figure out how to have this baby and raise this child completely alone. Her friend Monica came over, found Tanya on the couch surrounded by used tissues, staring at nothing, and immediately shifted into crisis management mode. She made Tanya eat, made her shower, made her start talking about practical matters, prenatal care and health insurance, and whether Tanya was going to keep working through the pregnancy. And when Tanya finally broke down and told Monica everything about Jin-woo, about the relationship, about how thoroughly she had been deceived, Monica held her and let her cry, and then said something that would stay with Tanya for years afterward. She said, "Baby, you fell in love, that's not a crime. And he's the one who lied, the one who ran, the one who's going to have to live with what he did. You didn't do anything wrong except trust someone who didn't deserve it." Tanya's grandmother found out about the pregnancy when Tanya was about 3 months along, showing enough that it couldn't be hidden anymore. The old woman didn't say, "I told you so," didn't lecture, didn't judge. She simply moved into Tanya's apartment, announced she was staying until the baby came, and started making plans for how they were going to manage this situation together. She told Tanya that sometimes men aren't strong enough to face their own choices, that running is easier than staying, that Jin-woo's weakness was his burden, not Tanya's. And while Tanya appreciated the support, appreciated not being alone, she couldn't help but think about Jin-woo, wonder where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about her and the child they had created together. What Tanya didn't know was that Jin-woo had indeed returned to Seoul, had sat at his dying father's bedside, had received the blessing and the instructions that would formally transfer leadership of the Park organization to him upon his father's death. What she didn't know was that Jin-woo had told his father about her, about the pregnancy, and that his father had looked at him with eyes that held both disappointment and a kind of terrible understanding. Sung-ho had told his son that leadership required sacrifice, that the organization had to come first always, that personal desires, no matter how genuine, had to be subordinated to duty and obligation and the preservation of everything the Park family had built over 3 generations. Jin-woo had asked if there was any way, if perhaps later, once his position was established, he might be able to acknowledge the child, might be able to provide support, even if he couldn't publicly claim the relationship. And his father had been very clear, there was no later, there was no compromise. The child and the woman had to remain completely separate from Jin-woo's life. In Seoul, any connection, any acknowledgement would be seen as weakness, and weakness in their world was fatal. Sung-ho told his son that the kindest thing Jin-woo could do for Tanya and for the child was to disappear completely, to give them the chance to build a life without him, rather than keeping them tied to a man who could never fully be present, never fully claim them, never give them the legitimacy and security they deserved. And so Jin-woo had done exactly that, had severed all contact, had eliminated every trace of his presence in Atlanta, had become a ghost in Tanya's life. He told himself he was doing the right thing, the honorable thing, that a clean break was better than stringing her along, better than making promises he couldn't keep. But late at night in his apartment in Seoul, he would think about Tanya, about the child growing inside her, about the life he might have had if he had been born into a different family or a different world. And he would feel something he had no name for, something that felt like grief for a future that had been possible for just a moment before duty and obligation and the weight of generations pulled him back into the only life he had ever really known. November 1998, Tanya gave birth to a son at Grady Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where she had worked as a nurse, where her colleagues threw her a baby shower and promised her they would help however they could. The labor was long and difficult, 22 hours of contractions and pain, and moments where Tanya thought she couldn't do this, couldn't bring this child into the world alone, without the father who should have been there holding her hand, telling her she was strong, telling her everything would be okay. But her grandmother was there, and Monica was there, and when the baby finally arrived, crying and healthy and perfect, Tanya held him and felt a complicated mixture of love and grief and determination that caught her completely off guard. She named him Marcus after her grandfather who had died before she was born, and Jean as a middle name, because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the abandonment, despite the anger, she still felt Jin-woo was this child's father, and Marcus deserved to carry some piece of that heritage, even if his father would never be part of his life. The hospital staff, assuming Jean was a family name from Tanya's side, didn't ask questions, and Tanya didn't offer explanations. Some things were too complicated to explain to strangers, some wounds were too fresh to expose to casual curiosity. The first 6 weeks were overwhelming in ways Tanya hadn't fully anticipated, even with all her nursing training, even with her grandmother's help. Marcus was colicky, cried for hours in the middle of the night, needed to be fed every 2 hours, needed constant attention and care. Tanya was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually drained in ways she hadn't known were possible. She had to go back to work after 6 weeks because she needed the health insurance, needed the income, needed to keep her apartment and pay her bills and provide for this tiny human who depended on her for everything. Her grandmother took care of Marcus during the day while Tanya worked, and at night Tanya took over so her grandmother could rest, and sleep became a luxury neither of them could fully afford. Money was constantly tight. Tanya had student loans from her undergraduate and graduate degrees, she had rent and utilities, and now she had diapers and formula and pediatrician visits and all the countless expenses that come with raising a child. She had to put her graduate studies on hold, couldn't afford to continue while working full-time and caring for an infant. The career in public health she had been building, the plans she had made for her future, all of that had to be postponed indefinitely while she focused on simple survival, making it through each day, each week, each month, without completely falling apart. But Marcus was beautiful in ways that made the struggle bearable. He had Jin-woo's eyes, exactly Jin-woo's eyes, almond-shaped and dark, and somehow already full of intelligence and curiosity, even as an infant. He had Jin-woo's serious expression, the way he would study faces and objects with intense focus, as if trying to understand how the world worked. As he grew, he developed Tanya's smile, her laugh, her stubbornness. But his features, his bone structure, his coloring all reflected his Korean heritage in ways that became more pronounced as he got older. Tanya's friends would comment on how striking he was, how beautiful, how unusual, and Tanya would smile and thank them and not mention that every time she looked at her son, she saw the man who had abandoned them both. Tanya's grandmother proved to be invaluable, not just practically, but emotionally. She had raised Tanya after Tanya's mother died, understood single parenthood, understood struggle and sacrifice, and making do with less than you needed. She told Tanya stories about her own mother, who had raised 5 children alone after Tanya's great-grandfather left, told her that women in their family had been surviving and thriving despite men's failures for generations. She told Tanya that Marcus didn't need a father who wasn't willing to be present, he needed a mother who was strong and present, and that was exactly what Tanya was giving him. As Marcus grew from infant to toddler, Tanya developed a routine that worked well enough. She worked 3 12-hour shifts a week at the hospital, which gave her 4 days at home with Marcus. She picked up occasional translation work she could do from home, brought in extra income without requiring childcare. She learned to be efficient with time and money, learned to ask for help when she needed it, learned to accept that perfect wasn't possible and good enough was actually pretty damn good under the circumstances. And gradually the acute pain of Jin-woo's betrayal faded into something more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound, a fact of her history rather than the defining feature of her present. But she never told Marcus about his father beyond the basics, that his father was Korean, that he had lived in Seoul, that he and Tanya had been together briefly, and then he had to return to Korea for family reasons, and they had lost touch. She kept it vague, kept it simple, because Marcus was too young to understand the full truth, and Tanya wasn't sure she was ready to explain it anyway. She kept one photograph, the picture of her and Jin-woo at Stone Mountain, both smiling at the camera, Jin-woo's arm around her shoulders, taken during those early months when everything still seemed possible. She kept it in a box in her closet, told herself she was saving it for Marcus for when he was old enough to want to know what his father looked like. But really she kept it because despite everything it was proof that Jin-woo had existed, that what they had shared had been real, even if it had ended in abandonment and lies. Park Jin-woo's father died 6 weeks after Jin-woo returned to Seoul from Atlanta, and the transition of power happened exactly as it had been planned. Jin-woo formally took his father's place at the head of the Park organization, accepted the pledges of loyalty from the various factions and affiliated groups, and stepped into a role he had been prepared for since childhood. He was 31 years old and controlled an empire that spanned legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises that employed hundreds of people directly and influenced thousands more, that brought in millions of dollars annually through a complex web of operations most people would never see or understand. The first 2 years were the hardest, not because Jin-woo wasn't capable, but because every new leader faces tests, challenges from rivals who want to see if the heir has his father's strength, or if he can be pushed aside, replaced with someone more pliable, more willing to make deals that benefit others at the Park family's expense. Jin-woo handled these challenges with a combination of strategic thinking and, when necessary, carefully calibrated violence. He demonstrated that he understood the old ways, honored the traditions, respected the hierarchy, but also that he was willing to adapt, willing to bring new approaches to old problems, willing to modernize operations in ways that made the organization more profitable and less vulnerable to law enforcement attention. He consolidated territories that had become inefficiently managed. He negotiated new arrangements with Chinese and Japanese organizations that expanded the Park family's influence beyond Seoul. He invested heavily in legitimate businesses, real estate, and technology ventures that both laundered criminal proceeds and generated genuine legal income. He brought in younger members who understood computers and digital communications, who could help the organization operate in an increasingly connected world while maintaining the security and secrecy that had always been essential. Within 5 years, Jin-woo had transformed the Park organization from a traditional Korean gang into something more sophisticated, more international, more sustainable for the long term. By all external measures, he was successful, respected by allies, feared by enemies, considered one of the most capable leaders of his generation in the Korean underworld. He lived in a penthouse apartment in Gangnam, wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and was courted by legitimate businessmen and politicians who understood that Jin-woo's organization could be a useful ally or a dangerous enemy. He attended the right parties, made the right donations, maintained relationships with the right people, and presented himself as a successful international businessman whose family's import-export operations happened to be very, very profitable. But those closest to him noticed things the way Jin-woo never married, despite numerous introductions to suitable women from prominent Korean families, the way he declined invitations that involved family gatherings or events focused on children, the way he sometimes seemed distant, preoccupied, as if part of his attention was always somewhere else. His most trusted lieutenant, a man named Lee who had grown up with Jin-woo and knew him better than most, occasionally asked if Jin-woo was happy, if this life they were living was what he really wanted, and Jin-woo would deflect, would talk about duty and obligation and the importance of honoring what previous generations had built. Late at night, when Jin-woo was alone in his apartment, he would sometimes take out a photograph he kept hidden in a locked drawer, a picture of Tanya smiling at the camera, wind blowing her hair back, taken during one of their weekends at the coast. He never tried to contact her, never tried to find out what had happened after he left, never allowed himself to investigate whether she had kept the pregnancy or what their child might look like if he even existed. Jin-woo told himself this distance was necessary, was the right choice, was protecting both Tanya and the child from complications they didn't need, but really it was self-protection, because knowing the details, knowing what he had abandoned, would make it impossible to function in the life he had chosen. He poured himself into work, spent 18-hour days managing operations, solving problems, expanding the organization's reach. He developed a reputation for being fair, but firm, for keeping his word, for never asking his people to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He made sure the families of men who worked for him were taken care of, made sure widows received support, made sure children could go to good schools. Because family loyalty, family obligation, these were principles Jin-woo still believed, and even if he had violated them in the most fundamental way possible by abandoning his own child. There were moments, usually late at night, usually after too much soju, when Jin-woo would think about what Marcus would look like now. Would he have Jin-woo's eyes, his build, his temperament? Would he speak Korean, or only English? Would he know anything about his heritage, or would he grow up completely American with no connection to the culture that defined half his DNA? Jin-woo imagined teaching him things: Korean history, martial arts, the importance of honor and loyalty, and then would catch himself realizing he had no right to those imagined moments, no claim on a child. He had never met a child whose mother he had betrayed in the worst possible way. Once, about 4 years after leaving Atlanta, Jin-woo was in Los Angeles for business meetings with Korean-American associates, and he found himself thinking about driving to Atlanta, thinking about trying to see Tanya from a distance, trying to catch a glimpse of Marcus if he existed, if Tanya had kept the pregnancy. But he didn't, because what would be the point? What could he possibly say or do that would make any of this better, that would justify the choice he had made? So he finished his business in Los Angeles and flew back to Seoul and tried to bury the thoughts, the memories, the persistent sense that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. And there was no way to undo it, no way to make it right. Marcus Gene Morrison grew up in Atlanta, raised by his mother and great-grandmother in a household that was loving but financially stressed, where every purchase was carefully considered, where nothing was wasted, where hard work and education were emphasized as the path to a better life. He was a bright child, curious, asked endless questions about how things worked, why things were the way they were, what words meant in different languages. Tanya enrolled him in a Korean language program at a local cultural center when he was 5, partly because she thought he should know something about his heritage, partly because she had noticed he sometimes used Korean words without knowing where he had learned them, and it seemed easier to give him formal instruction than to try to explain the inexplicable. The language came easily to Marcus, more easily than it should have for a child with no native speakers at home. His teachers commented on his pronunciation, his intuitive grasp of grammatical structures that usually took students years to master. Tanya watched her son speaking Korean and felt complicated emotions: pride that he was honoring part of his identity, grief that his father, who should have been teaching him these things, was absent by choice rather than circumstance. Marcus asked about his father, occasionally casual questions that Tanya answered as honestly as she could without revealing the full truth. Your father had to return to Korea for family reasons. We lost touch. He doesn't know about you. It's complicated, sweetheart, and I promise I'll explain more when you're older. Marcus seemed to accept these explanations, at least on the surface. He didn't push, didn't demand details, seemed content with the family. He had his mother, who worked hard and loved him fiercely, his great-grandmother, who told him stories and made him his favorite foods, his extended circle of his mother's friends who treated him like their own nephew. But Tanya noticed things: the way Marcus would study his own face in the mirror, the way he paid attention to other Asian kids at school, trying to figure out where he fit in the racial and cultural landscape of Atlanta, the way he sometimes seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite name. When Marcus was 7, he came home from school with a family tree project. He needed to fill in information about his parents and grandparents and great-grandparents going back as far as he knew. Tanya helped him fill in her side of the family, told him stories about her mother and grandmother and the generations before them who had survived slavery and Jim Crow and built lives despite systemic oppression and injustice. But when they got to his father's side of the tree, Marcus had almost nothing to write, just a name, Park Jin-woo, and a place, Seoul, South Korea, and the dates of birth Tanya remembered from those long-ago conversations. Marcus asked if there were any pictures, and Tanya hesitated before going to her closet and retrieving the box where she kept the photograph from Stone Mountain. She gave it to Marcus, watched him study his father's face with an intensity that broke her heart. Marcus carried the photo to the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, holding it up next to his own face, comparing features. When he came back to the living room, he had tears in his eyes, and he said very quietly, "I have his eyes, don't I?" And Tanya pulled him into her arms and said, "Yes, baby, you do. You have his eyes and his stubbornness and his intelligence, and those are good things to have even if he's not here to see them." That night after Marcus was asleep, Tanya sat in her living room holding that photograph and thinking about Jin-woo, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about the child they had created together. She felt anger that Marcus was growing up with this absence, this gap in his identity that couldn't be fully filled with stories or photographs. Anger that Jin-woo had chosen to walk away, had chosen his life in Seoul over being a father. But she also felt a deep sadness because she could see Marcus beginning to understand that he was different, that his family looked different from most of his friends' families, that there were questions about his identity and heritage that didn't have easy answers. As Marcus got older, the questions became more pointed, more difficult to deflect. Why doesn't my father want to know me? Did he know about me before he left? What did he do in Korea that was so important he couldn't stay or come back? Tanya tried to be honest without being bitter, tried to explain that sometimes people make choices that hurt other people not because they don't care, but because they feel trapped by circumstances or obligations that seem more important in the moment than they actually are. She told Marcus that his father's absence wasn't about Marcus, wasn't because Marcus was somehow not good enough or not wanted. It was about his father's limitations, his inability to be brave enough to choose love over duty. Marcus seemed to understand intellectually, but Tanya could see the impact, the way he was sometimes withdrawn, the way he worked extra hard at school, as if trying to prove he was worth knowing, the way he seemed to be constantly trying to understand where he fit in a world that often saw him as other. He was biracial in a society that still often thought in binary racial categories. He was half Korean, but didn't know Korea or his Korean family. He was being raised by women in a culture that still valued fathers and male role models, and Tanya watched her son navigate all of this with a maturity that seemed beyond his years and wished desperately that things could have been different. When Marcus was 10, Tanya finally finished her master's degree in public health that she had put on hold. When he was born, she walked across the stage at graduation with Marcus and her grandmother in the audience and felt a pride that was tempered by awareness of how much longer this had taken than it should have, how much harder it had been doing it while raising a child alone. She got a better job at the county health department working on programs for underserved communities, and the increase in income meant they could move to a better apartment, could afford things like Marcus's taekwondo classes and summer programs that had been impossible before. Life got incrementally easier, more stable, more predictable, and Tanya allowed herself to hope that maybe they had gotten through the hardest part, that maybe the future would be less about survival and more about actually thriving. Seoul 2006. Park Jin-woo was 39 years old and had been leading the Park organization for 8 years. He had successfully navigated the dangerous early years of his leadership, had consolidated power, had built the organization into something more sophisticated and profitable than it had ever been under his father's leadership. But he had also become more isolated, more withdrawn, even from his closest associates. He went through the motions of his life with competence and efficiency, but there was a hollowness to it, a sense that he was performing a role rather than actually living. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, unmarked manila envelope delivered to Jin-woo's private office by his secretary, who said it had been dropped off by courier with instructions that it should be given only to Jin-woo personally. Jin-woo opened it without particular concern or suspicion. Business associates and contacts often sent materials by courier when they contained sensitive information that shouldn't go through regular mail. Inside was a photograph, a school picture of the kind taken every year in American elementary schools. A young boy with dark hair, almond-shaped eyes, and a serious expression, wearing a blue shirt and sitting in front of a mottled gray background. Jin-woo stared at the photograph for a long moment, not understanding why someone would send him a random picture of a child. And then he saw the eyes, and his breath caught in his throat, because those eyes were his eyes, exactly his eyes, the same shape, the same expression, the same way of looking directly at the camera, as if assessing the person behind it. He turned the photograph over and found 3 words written in Korean: "He has your eyes," and Jin-woo's hand started shaking. Because this wasn't random, this was his son, this was the child he had walked away from 8 years ago. This was proof that Tanya had kept the pregnancy, that Marcus existed, that Jin-woo was a father whether he had chosen to acknowledge it or not. He sat at his desk for almost an hour just staring at that photograph, trying to process what it meant that someone knew about Marcus, knew where he was, new enough to have obtained a school photograph and sent it to Jin-woo. This wasn't public information. Tanya had no reason to have any contact with anyone from Jin-woo's world in Seoul. So who had sent this, and more importantly, why? Was this a threat, a warning, an attempt at blackmail, a message from someone who wanted Jin-woo to know that they had leverage over him, that his carefully hidden secret wasn't as secret as he had believed? Jin-woo called Lee, his most trusted lieutenant, into his office and showed him the photograph, explained in brief terms that 8 years ago, he had been involved with a woman in Atlanta, that she had been pregnant when he left, that he had never told anyone in the organization about this, because it would have been seen as a complication, a weakness, a liability. Lee studied the photograph, then looked at Jin-woo with an expression that combined surprise, concern, and something that might have been sympathy, and asked what Jin-woo wanted to do about it. Jin-woo said he needed information, needed to know who had sent this, needed to know if this was an isolated incident or the beginning of something larger, needed to understand the threat level before he could decide how to respond. Within 72 hours, Lee had assembled a detailed report using contacts in the Korean American community in Atlanta, using private investigators who specialized in discreet inquiries. The report included Tanya's current address, her employment history, Marcus's school records, photographs of both of them taken from a distance going about their daily lives. Jin-woo studied these materials with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This was Tanya, 8 years older, but still beautiful, still carrying herself with that same strength and dignity that had attracted him in the first place. And this was Marcus, 7 years old, already showing signs of the person he would become: intelligent, serious, carrying himself with a confidence that suggested Tanya had done while raising him, had given him a stable, loving home despite Jin-woo's absence. The report noted details that caught Jin-woo's attention. Marcus attended Korean language classes at a local cultural center, was enrolled in Taekwondo, wore a small silver pendant on a chain around his neck that Jin-woo recognized immediately as the necklace he had given Tanya years ago. The one he had told her was his mother's. Tanya had given it to their son, had passed along this tangible connection to Jin-woo's heritage, even though Jin-woo himself had severed all other connections. The realization made Jin-woo feel something he couldn't quite name: grief, shame, longing for what might have been if he had made different choices 8 years ago. For 3 weeks, Jin-woo wrestled with what to do with this information. He couldn't simply ignore it, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen evidence that his son existed, that Tanya had raised him alone, that Marcus had Jin-woo's eyes and his heritage and no knowledge of the father who had abandoned him before birth. But Jin-woo also couldn't see a clear path forward, couldn't figure out how to acknowledge this situation without creating complications for everyone involved. Going to Atlanta would mean exposing the secret he had kept for 8 years, would mean admitting to his organization that he had a weakness, a vulnerability that rivals could exploit. Not going meant continuing to live with the knowledge that he had a son he would never know, a child who would grow up without a father because Jin-woo had been too weak to choose differently. The decision was made for him when a second envelope arrived 3 weeks after the first. This one contained a note typed in Korean: "Your enemies know about the boy, they know where he lives, they know he is your weakness." And beneath that, a photograph of Marcus leaving school, walking with Tanya, both of them unaware they were being photographed, both of them vulnerable in ways that made Jin-woo's blood run cold. This wasn't a general warning, this was specific, immediate, a threat that required action, because Jin-woo's world was one where weakness was exploited, where rivals looked for any advantage, any leverage, and a secret child in another country, with no protection, no connection to Jin-woo's organization, would be seen as the perfect target. Jin-woo called Lee back into his office, showed him the second envelope, and said, "I need to go to Atlanta, I need to warn her, I need to make sure they're protected." And Lee nodded and said, "I'll make arrangements, but you need to think carefully about what you're going to do when you get there, because once you acknowledge this, once you step back into their lives, there's no undoing it. You can't walk away again." Jin-woo knew Lee was right, knew that going to Atlanta meant making a choice that would have consequences he couldn't fully predict, but the alternative, leaving Marcus and Tanya unprotected while rivals circled, was simply not acceptable, not when Jin-woo had the resources and the power to keep them safe. He booked a flight under a false name, arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport on a Tuesday morning, and checked into a hotel in Buckhead, using cash and fake identification to avoid leaving any trail that could be followed. He rented a car, drove to the address in Decatur where Tanya lived, and sat outside watching the house, trying to find the courage to walk up to the door, to face the woman he had betrayed, to explain why he had come back after 8 years of silence. The house was modest, but well-maintained, flowers in the garden, a swing set in the backyard, signs of a life that was stable and normal, and completely separate from the world of violence and crime that Jin-woo inhabited. He sat there for 45 minutes watching light move across the windows, imagining the life happening inside that house, imagining Marcus doing homework or playing, imagining Tanya cooking dinner or helping her grandmother with something. And then the front door opened and Tanya stepped out onto the porch, and Jin-woo's heart stopped because she looked exactly like he remembered and nothing like he remembered. She was older, yes, had lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but she still moved with that same grace, still held herself with that same quiet strength. And when she looked directly at his car, directly at him, through the windshield, Jin-woo knew she had seen him, knew she had recognized him despite the years, despite the distance, despite everything. Tanya Morrison stood on her porch for a long moment, just staring at the car parked across the street, her mind trying to process what her eyes were telling her, that Park Jin-woo was sitting in that car, that the man who had disappeared from her life 8 years ago, without explanation, without apology, had somehow found her address and was now watching her house. Her first instinct was anger, hot, immediate fury that he would show up now after all this time, after everything she had been through, raising Marcus alone, struggling to make ends meet, building a life from the wreckage he had left behind. Her second instinct was fear, because if Jin-woo had found her, if he knew where she lived, then what did that mean for Marcus, for the carefully constructed explanations she had given about his father, for the privacy and safety she had tried to maintain? She walked down her porch steps, crossed her small front yard, and strode directly to the car, her hands shaking with adrenaline, with emotions she hadn't fully felt in years. She opened the passenger door without asking, without hesitating, slid into the seat, and turned to look at Jin-woo, really look at him for the first time in 8 years. He was older, had the kind of lines and gray hair that came with stress and responsibility, but his eyes were the same Marcus's eyes, and seeing them in Jin-woo's face after seeing them every day in her son's face made Tanya's throat tight with emotions she didn't want to feel. Before Jin-woo could speak, Tanya said in a voice that was calm but edged with steel, "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here now after 8 years of nothing, no phone call, no letter, no explanation. You just disappeared, and now you're sitting outside my house. Like what? Like you have some kind of right to be here." Jin-woo started to respond, but Tanya held up her hand and continued, "I don't know what you want, I don't know why you're here, but before you say anything, before you try to explain or justify, or whatever it is you think you need to do, I need you to understand that Marcus is my son, mine, and I have raised him and protected him and given him a good life without you, and if you think you can just show up and disrupt that, then you don't understand anything about what it means to be a father." Jin-woo let her speak, let her get the words out that she clearly needed to say, and when she finally stopped, when the anger seemed to have temporarily exhausted itself, he said quietly, "I know I have no right to be here. I know what I did was unforgivable, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or to disrupt Marcus's life. I'm here because he's in danger." The words hung in the air between them, and Tanya's expression shifted from anger to confusion to fear as she said, "What do you mean in danger?" And Jin-woo pulled out the 2 photographs, the school picture and the surveillance photo, and showed them to her, and explained in careful terms that there were people who knew about Marcus, who saw him as leverage, who might try to use him to get to Jin-woo. Tanya stared at the photographs, her hands shaking as she processed what Jin-woo was telling her, and then she looked up at him and said, "Who are you? What do you really do? Because import-export doesn't explain any of this, doesn't explain why someone would be taking pictures of my son, doesn't explain why you think he's in danger." And Jin-woo knew he couldn't keep lying, knew that Tanya deserved at minimum the truth about what he was and what kind of world he had brought into her life, even if indirectly. So he told her, explained about his family's organization, about the Korean underworld, about his role as a leader in that world, about why their relationship 8 years ago had been impossible from his organization's perspective. Tanya listened without interrupting, her face going through a range of expressions: shock, disbelief, understanding, and finally a kind of resigned recognition, as if pieces were falling into place, explanations for things that had never quite made sense about Jin-woo's behavior, his careful way of speaking, his mysterious disappearances, his reluctance to talk about his family. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. And then she said, "So you're telling me you're a gangster, a criminal, and that's why you left, because your gang or organization or whatever you call it wouldn't accept that you had a child with me?" Jin-woo flinched at the blunt assessment, but nodded and said, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you, and I know how it sounds, but it's the truth." Tanya laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a kind of bitter acknowledgement of how thoroughly she had been deceived. And she said I fell in love with a lie. I built dreams around a person who didn't exist. And now you're here telling me that the son I've raised, the child I've protected, might be in danger because of choices you made, because of a life you lead that I knew nothing about. How am I supposed to process that, Jin-woo? How am I supposed to trust anything you say when everything about our relationship was a lie from the beginning? Jin-woo had no good answer to that, could only say, I understand why you hate me, I understand why you have every right to never want to see me again, but I need you to put that aside for now, because Marcus's safety is what matters, and I have resources, I have people who can protect you both, but I need you to let me help. Tanya looked at him with eyes that held both pain and calculation, and asked the question that would determine everything. Are you here to protect him, or are you here to take him? Because I need to know, Jin-woo. I need to know what you really want before I let you anywhere near my son. Jin-woo met her eyes and said with complete honesty, I don't have the right to take him. I gave up that right 8 years ago when I walked away. I'm here to protect him, to make sure the mistakes I made don't hurt him, to do what I should have done from the beginning, which is make sure that you both are safe and provided for regardless of what that means for me. Tanya studied his face, looking for lies, looking for hidden motivations, and seemed to find something in his expression that allowed her to make a decision. She said, Marcus gets home from school in 40 minutes. I need to prepare him. I need to figure out what to tell him. And then if you want to meet your son, you can, but on my terms in my house. And if he doesn't want to see you, if this is too much for him, then you leave and you don't come back. Do you understand? Jin-woo understood, knew he was being given a chance he didn't deserve, knew that Tanya was showing him a grace and compassion that went far beyond what he had earned, and he nodded and said, thank you for this. I know it's more than I deserve. Tanya got out of the car, walked back to her house, and Jin-woo sat alone, trying to prepare himself for what came next, trying to figure out what he would say to the son he had never met, trying to understand how his life had brought him to this moment, sitting in a rental car in suburban Atlanta, about to face the consequences of choices he had made 8 years ago. Marcus Gene Morrison came home from school at 3:47 in the afternoon, same as always, dropped his backpack by the front door, same as always, called out, Mom, I'm home, same as always. But when he walked into the living room, he knew immediately that something was different. His mother was sitting on the couch, and there was a man sitting in the armchair across from her, a Korean man in an expensive suit, who looked at Marcus with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear, and something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Tanya stood up, went to Marcus, and said in a voice that was carefully calm, Sweetheart, we need to talk. There's someone here. I want you to meet someone I should have introduced you to a long time ago. She gestured to Jin-woo, who also stood, and Marcus looked between his mother and this stranger, trying to understand what was happening, trying to read the tension in the room, the way his mother's hands were shaking slightly, the way the man was looking at him with those familiar eyes. Marcus was 7 years old, but he was perceptive, had learned to read situations, to understand unspoken dynamics. And he said slowly, Is this my father? And Tanya's eyes filled with tears as she nodded and said, Yes, baby, this is your father. His name is Jin-woo, and he came from Korea to see you. Marcus stood very still, processing this information, staring at the man who was his father, taking in the expensive suit, the careful posture, the eyes that were exactly like the eyes Marcus saw in the mirror every morning, exactly like the eyes in the photograph from Stone Mountain that Marcus had studied so many times he had memorized every detail. Jin-woo dropped to one knee. So he was at Marcus's eye level, a gesture of respect and equality, and he said in English that carried a slight accent, Hello, Marcus, I know this is confusing and surprising and probably scary, but I want you to know that I'm not here to disrupt your life. I'm not here to take you away from your mother. I'm just here to meet you and to make sure you're safe. His voice was gentle, patient, giving Marcus space to process, to respond or not respond as he chose. Marcus studied his father with the same serious expression Tanya had seen Jin-woo, where years ago, the same way of assessing people carefully before deciding how to respond. And then Marcus said in Korean that was surprisingly fluent, Why did you leave? And Jin-woo's eyes widened in surprise that his son spoke Korean, that he had asked the question in his father's language. Jin-woo responded in Korean, Because I thought I was doing the right thing, because I thought leaving was better than trying to be part of your life when I couldn't do it properly. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And then switching to English so Tanya could understand, I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I left your mother. I'm sorry for all the ways I failed both of you. Marcus continued to study his father, and then he said, You have my eyes, and Jin-woo smiled a sad smile and said, Actually, you have my eyes and my stubbornness, and I'm told you're very smart, which you get from your mother, And from what I understand, you're learning Korean and Taekwondo, which means you're learning about part of your heritage, even though I wasn't here to teach you. Marcus nodded and said, Mom got me a teacher, Mr. Kim. He's from Seoul. Like you, he says my pronunciation is very good. And Jin-woo said your pronunciation is excellent. I can tell you've worked very hard. There was a long pause, and then Marcus asked the question that mattered most, are you going to leave again? Because if you're just going to leave, then I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to know you, because it hurts less if you just stay gone. The words were devastating in their directness, in their mature understanding of how abandonment worked, how it was sometimes easier to have nothing than to have something that would be taken away. And Tanya watched Jin-woo's face crumple, with emotion watched him struggle to maintain composure in front of this child, who deserved honest answers, not comforting lies. Jin-woo said, I can't promise I'll be here every day. I have responsibilities in Seoul. I have work I have to do, but I can promise that I won't disappear again. I won't leave without explanation. I won't make you wonder if I'm ever coming back, if that's okay with you. If you want me to be part of your life in whatever way works, then I will be. And if you decide you don't want that, if you're happier without me, then I'll respect that too. Marcus looked at his mother, and Tanya gave him a small nod, giving him permission to make this decision for himself. And Marcus turned back to Jin-woo and said, can you teach me more Korean? Can you tell me about my family in Seoul? Can you show me where you live? And Jin-woo nodded and said, yes to all of that, yes to anything you want to know, anything you want to learn. Marcus stepped closer to Jin-woo, reached out, and touched his father's face, tracing the features that mirrored his own. And then he said very quietly, you look like me. And Jin-woo pulled his son into his arms and said, no, Marcus, you look like you. You're your own person, and you're perfect. And I'm sorry I missed the first 7 years of your life, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be there for the rest of it. Marcus hugged his father back tentatively at first, and then more tightly, and Tanya watched this reunion feeling emotions that were too complicated to name. Grief for the years Jin-woo had missed, relief that Marcus was finally meeting his father, fear about what this would mean for their future. They talked for 3 hours, Jin-woo telling Marcus about Seoul, about Korean history and culture, about the Park family's legitimate businesses, carefully editing the parts that a 7-year-old didn't need to know. Marcus showed Jin-woo his schoolwork, his Korean language homework, his Taekwondo certificates, and Jin-woo praised everything with genuine pride and enthusiasm. Tanya watched them interact, watched Marcus slowly warm to this man, who was his father, watched Jin-woo be gentle and patient, and everything a father should be, and wondered why he couldn't have been this person 8 years ago, why it had taken threats and danger to bring him back. When Jin-woo finally said he needed to get back to his hotel, Marcus asked when he would see him again, and Jin-woo looked at Tanya, waiting for her to set the terms. Tanya said, you can come to dinner tomorrow if you want, we eat at 6, and Jin-woo nodded gratefully and said, I'll be here. And when he left, Marcus turned to his mother and asked, is he a good person, Mom? Is my father a good person? And Tanya had to think carefully about how to answer, because the truth was complicated and Marcus deserved better than simple lies. She said, your father made choices that hurt people, including you and me, but he's trying to make better choices now. And that's what matters. People can change, people can decide to be better than they were, and we have to give them the chance to show us who they want to be now, rather than only judging them for who they were before. Marcus seemed to accept this, nodded, and said, I think I want to know him. I think I want him to be part of our family, if that's okay. And Tanya pulled her son into her arms and said, it's okay, baby, it's your choice, and I'll support whatever you decide. Over the next week, Jin-woo came to dinner every evening, staying at first for just an hour or two, and gradually for longer, as Marcus became more comfortable, as the initial awkwardness faded into something that resembled a tentative relationship. Jin-woo told Tanya in private that he had hired security people who would watch the house and Marcus's school discreetly, making sure no one approached them, making sure the threats he had warned about didn't materialize. Tanya wanted to refuse, wanted to insist they didn't need protection, but she also understood that Jin-woo's world operated by rules she didn't fully comprehend, and that refusing his help might put Marcus at greater risk. Jin-woo also told her he wanted to set up a trust fund for Marcus, wanted to make sure that college would be paid for, that Tanya wouldn't have to struggle financially, that Marcus would have resources and opportunities regardless of what happened to Jin-woo in the future. Tanya's first instinct was to refuse this too, was to say she didn't want his money, didn't want to be bought, or to have Marcus's affection bought. But Tanya was also practical enough to understand that her pride was less important than Marcus's future, and that accepting Jin-woo's financial support didn't mean forgiving him for the past. It just meant ensuring Marcus had the best possible chances going forward. During one of their dinners, Marcus asked Jin-woo about his family, and Seoul asked if he had grandparents or aunts or uncles or cousins, and Jin-woo had to explain carefully that his father had died years ago, that his mother had passed away when Jin-woo was young, that he didn't have siblings. He didn't mention that there were dozens of people in Seoul who were connected to the park organization who considered themselves family in a different sense, because that was a complication Marcus didn't need to understand yet. Marcus seemed disappointed, asked if that meant he didn't have any family in Korea, and Jin-woo said, "You have me, and that's a start. Maybe someday you can visit Seoul, and I can show you where I live, where your family came from." Tanya and Jin-woo had their own conversations after Marcus went to bed, sitting on her small back porch, talking about the past, about the choices they had made, about what came next. Jin-woo told her more about his world, more about the pressures he had faced 8 years ago, the impossible choice between acknowledging her and Marcus or taking his place in the organization that had been his birthright. He didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify what he had done, but he wanted her to understand the context, the cultural expectations, the very real danger that would have come with open defiance. Tanya listened and understood intellectually, but emotionally it was harder to process, because at the end of the day Jin-woo had chosen his organization over her, over Marcus, and that choice had defined the last 8 years of her life. She asked him what had changed, why he was here now, and Jin-woo explained about the photographs, about the threats, about his realization that his attempts to protect them by staying away had actually left them more vulnerable than if he had maintained some connection all along. He said, "I thought distance would keep you safe, but I was wrong. The only way to keep you safe is to acknowledge you, to make it clear that anyone who threatens you threatens me." This led to a difficult conversation about what Jin-woo's presence in their lives would mean going forward, what it would look like for him to be Marcus's father when he lived half a world away, when his life in Seoul was fundamentally incompatible with the life Tanya had built in Atlanta. Jin-woo proposed a solution. He would come to Atlanta for extended visits 3 or 4 months out of the year. He would maintain a residence there. He would be present in Marcus's life in a real and ongoing way. In exchange, he needed Tanya to understand that there were aspects of his life in Seoul that he couldn't walk away from, obligations that predated Marcus that would require him to return regularly. Tanya asked if he was married, if there was someone else in Seoul, and Jin-woo said, "No, there's never been anyone else. Since you, I've had relationships expected by my position, but nothing real, nothing that mattered." And Tanya felt something shift in her chest at this admission, felt the careful walls she had built around her heart start to crack. She asked why he had never tried to contact her in 8 years, why he had stayed away so completely, and Jin-woo said, "Because I thought it would be easier for both of us if it was a clean break, because I was a coward, because I didn't know how to face what I had done, and every day that passed made it harder to imagine reaching out, until eventually it seemed impossible." Tanya said, "You broke my heart. You made me feel like I wasn't enough, like our child wasn't enough to make you stay." And Jin-woo reached for her hand and said, "You were always enough. You were more than enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't brave enough. And I've regretted that every single day for 8 years." And Tanya didn't pull her hand away, even though part of her wanted to, because despite everything, despite the pain and the anger and the betrayal, there was still something between them, still a connection that 8 years and an ocean hadn't entirely severed. They sat in silence for a while, hands still touching, and then Tanya asked, "What happens now? What does this look like going forward?" And Jin-woo said, "Honestly, I don't know. I've never done this before, never tried to be a father, never tried to balance 2 different lives in 2 different countries. But I want to try if you'll let me. I want to be there for Marcus, want to support you, want to figure out how to make this work in whatever way is best for him." Tanya said, "I need to think about this, need to process what you've told me, need to figure out if I can trust you again." And Jin-woo nodded and said, "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere, not without telling you first." That night, after Jin-woo left, Tanya's grandmother, who had been watching these developments with quiet attention, pulled Tanya aside and said, "That man loves you both. You know that, right? Whatever else he is, whatever mistakes he's made, he loves you and Marcus, and that's not nothing." Tanya said love wasn't enough to make him stay 8 years ago. "Why should I believe it's enough now?" And her grandmother said, "Because now he knows what he lost. Now he understands the cost of his choices. People don't usually get second chances like this, baby. And if you can find a way to forgive him, if he can prove he's changed, then maybe you can build something new, something better than what you had before." Tanya wanted to believe that, wanted to think that Jin-woo's return could be the beginning of something good rather than just another complication in her already complicated life, but she was wary, cautious, protective of both herself and Marcus. She had survived Jin-woo's absence, had built a good life despite it, and she wasn't willing to risk that stability unless she was certain Jin-woo was genuinely committed to being present, to being the father Marcus deserved. 3 days later, Jin-woo received a phone call from Lee in Seoul, his lieutenant's voice tense, as he explained that the Council of Senior Bosses wanted Jin-woo to return immediately. There were development situations that required his direct attention, decisions that couldn't wait. Jin-woo knew what this meant. The organization was testing him, forcing him to choose between his responsibilities in Seoul and his newfound commitment to Marcus and Tanya. This was the moment Lee had warned him about, the moment when Jin-woo would have to decide what mattered more, his position or his family. Jin-woo told Lee he needed 24 hours to handle things in Atlanta, and Lee said carefully, they're not going to like that, they're going to see it as putting personal matters above organizational business. And Jin-woo said, let them see it however they want. I'll be back in Seoul in 2 days, but I'm not leaving Atlanta without explaining the situation to Marcus, without making arrangements, without keeping my promise. Lee was silent for a moment, and then said, you're really doing this, aren't you? You're really choosing them. And Jin-woo said, I'm not choosing one over the other. I'm trying to find a way to honor both. And if the organization can't accept that, then maybe I'm not the right person to lead it. Jin-woo went to Tanya's house that evening and told her about the phone call, about the demands from Seoul, about the fact that he had to return soon, but that he wanted to make a proposal first. He said, I've been thinking about what you said about trust, about needing to know I'm committed, and I understand that words aren't enough, so I want to make you a promise, a real one. I'm going to step back from day-to-day leadership of the organization in Seoul. I'm going to transition power to Lee, who is more than capable. I'm going to maintain my position and my connections, but I'm not going to let it consume my life the way it has for the past 8 years. Tanya asked what that meant practically, and Jin-woo explained that he would spend 3 months in Seoul handling essential business and 3 months in Atlanta being a father to Marcus, being present in their lives in a real way. He would maintain the security arrangements, would ensure they were protected, would provide financial support, but more importantly, he would be there for school events, for taekwondo tests, for birthday parties, for all the ordinary moments that made up a childhood. He said, I can't undo the past 8 years, I can't give Marcus back the time I missed, but I can make sure I don't miss any more of his life, if that's what you want. Tanya said, you're asking me to trust you, to believe that you'll keep this promise when you broke every promise you made 8 years ago. How do I know this time is different? And Jin-woo said, because 8 years ago, I was trying to be 2 different people, trying to live 2 incompatible lives, and pretending I could make it work. This time, I'm not pretending, I'm being honest about who I am and what I do, and I'm asking you to accept all of it, the good and the bad, the complicated and the messy. If you can't accept that, if you need someone simpler, someone without my history, then I understand, but I need you to know that my commitment to Marcus, to you, is real, and I'm willing to prove it. Tanya thought about this, thought about the risk of letting Jin-woo back into their lives, thought about what it would mean for Marcus to have his father present and active versus having him as an occasional visitor or a monthly phone call. She thought about her grandmother's words about second chances, about people proving they had changed, and she thought about the look on Marcus's face when he talked about his father, the happiness that had been absent before Jin-woo arrived. And she made a decision that was equal parts hope and faith and practical assessment of what was best for her son. She said, okay, I'm willing to try this, willing to see if you can keep your promises, but I need you to understand that if you disappear again, if you break Marcus's heart the way you broke mine, I will never forgive you, and I will make sure you never have another chance. Jin-woo nodded and said, I understand, and I promise you, I won't let either of you down, not again. And Tanya said, we'll see, actions matter more than words, and you've got a lot of proving to do. Jin-woo returned to Seoul 2 days later, but before he left, he sat down with Marcus and explained that he had to go back to Korea for work, but that he would return in 3 months, and that in the meantime, they would video call every week and Marcus could ask him anything he wanted to know. Marcus asked if Jin-woo was leaving forever like last time, and Jin-woo said, no, Marcus, this is different. I'm coming back, I promise I'm coming back. And Marcus said, people say they promise, and then they don't come back. And Jin-woo's heart broke at the pain in his son's voice, at the awareness that Marcus had learned too young that promises from adults weren't always kept. Jin-woo said, I know I gave you reason not to trust me, I know I wasn't there before, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you that I mean it this time. And if I break that promise, if I let you down, then you have every right to never trust me again. Marcus studied his father's face, looking for truth, looking for reassurance, and finally nodded and said, okay, but you have to really come back. You can't just say you will and then not do it. and Jin-woo said, "I will come back, Marcus, I will always come back from now on." In Seoul, Jin-woo met with the Council of Senior Bosses and laid out his plan to transition day-to-day operations to Lee while maintaining his overall leadership and strategic direction. There was resistance, concerns that Jin-woo was abandoning his responsibilities, that he was allowing personal matters to interfere with business. But Jin-woo stood firm, explained that he had found a way to balance both obligations, that his presence in America actually gave the organization advantages in terms of international operations and relationships. He didn't tell them about Marcus, didn't reveal the personal reasons behind his decision, because that was information they didn't need and wouldn't understand. Over the next 3 months, Jin-woo proved his system could work. He managed operations from Atlanta via secure communications. He flew back to Seoul when absolutely necessary for important meetings or negotiations, but he kept his promises to Marcus, showed up for video calls, attended Marcus's taekwondo test via video links, sent gifts and letters, and maintained a presence in his son's life, even from thousands of miles away. And when 3 months had passed, Jin-woo returned to Atlanta exactly as he had promised, and the look on Marcus's face when he saw his father walk through the door made every difficult negotiation, every argument with the council, every sacrifice worth it. The years that followed were not easy, integrating Jin-woo into their lives, maintaining the careful balance between his world and theirs, navigating the complexity of a family that existed across continents and cultures. There were difficult moments, times when Jin-woo's business in Seoul required longer absences than planned, times when Tanya questioned whether this arrangement could really work long-term, times when Marcus struggled with having a father who was present but not quite the way other kids' fathers were present. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. Marcus's 10th birthday, when Jin-woo flew in early and surprised him at school. Marcus's first visit to Seoul, when he was 12 and Jin-woo showed him the city, the culture, the heritage that was half of who he was. The slow rebuilding of trust between Tanya and Jin-woo as he proved over and over that this time his promises meant something. Jin-woo never fully left his world in Seoul, never completely walked away from the organization, but he found a way to be both the leader his family's legacy demanded and the father his son deserved. Tanya eventually finished her doctorate in public health, built a successful career directing maternal and child health programs for underserved communities. She and Jin-woo never remarried, never lived together in the traditional sense, but they built something that worked for them, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Marcus, and eventually a rekindling of the feelings that had brought them together years ago, tempered now by experience and hard-won wisdom. They learned to be honest with each other about the limitations and possibilities of their situation, learned to build a life that accommodated Jin-woo's obligations without letting those obligations consume everything else. Marcus grew up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable, moving between Atlanta and Seoul, between his mother's world and his father's, learning to navigate the complexity of being both Korean and Black American, understanding that identity wasn't simple or singular, but rich with multiple influences and possibilities. He studied international relations in college, worked as a cultural consultant, helping Korean businesses navigate American markets and American businesses understand Korean culture, using his unique position to bridge gaps that others couldn't. Jin-woo's organization eventually accepted the reality of his situation. Some of the older bosses never fully approved, but the younger generation saw Jin-woo's international connections, his ability to move between worlds, as an asset rather than a liability. The threats that had initially brought Jin-woo back to Atlanta never materialized, whether because Jin-woo's security arrangements were effective or because his rivals decided Marcus wasn't worth the risk of provoking Jin-woo's wrath. And every year on Marcus's birthday, Jin-woo would tell him the same thing: "You are the best decision I almost didn't make," reminding both of them that sometimes the most important choices are the ones we initially get wrong, but then find the courage to correct. Marcus would laugh and say, "You mean I'm the decision you did make just 8 years late?" And Jin-woo would smile and say, "Yes, exactly that. And I'm grateful every day that I got a second chance to get it right." Tanya's grandmother lived to see Marcus graduate from college, lived to see the family that had been broken come together in a new configuration that worked despite all the reasons it shouldn't have. Before she died, she told Tanya, "I'm proud of you, baby, proud of how you raised that boy, proud that you found a way to forgive, proud that you didn't let bitterness rob you of the possibility of love." And Tanya held her grandmother's hand, Instead, I learned from the best learned that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about finding ways to heal and keep going. This story is about choices, about the moment when a man realizes that legacy isn't just about power passed down through bloodlines, but about love passed down through sacrifice, through showing up, even when it's hard, through proving that people can change, can become better than they were. Park Jin-woo had built an empire in Seoul, had commanded respect and fear, and wielded power that most people could never imagine. But his greatest accomplishment, the thing he was most proud of, was being Marcus's father, being present in his son's life, being someone Marcus could count on. So we want to ask you, if you were Park Jin-woo, what would you have chosen 8 years ago? Would you have stayed in Atlanta with Tanya and the pregnancy, knowing it would mean giving up everything your family had built for generations? Or would you have returned to Seoul to fulfill the obligations you were raised to honor? And having made that choice, having left, would you have had the courage to come back 8 years later to face the consequences, to try to make things right? Or would you have left the past buried, convinced that some mistakes are too big to fix? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make and the prices we pay for those choices, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't building an empire or maintaining traditions or honoring obligations. It's admitting they were wrong, showing up anyway, trying to do better, and proving that love, even love that has been tested and broken and rebuilt, can be strong enough to bridge continents and cultures, and the distance between who we were and who we choose to become.